while we're waiting, is there anything specific, like any specific questions you want to be sure I go through with the condo offer? Or are you just so fresh that just, I think you're muted.
Hold on.
There you go.
Okay. I wrote my first offer to purchase like a week and a half ago, and it was accepted. So I just figured I'd at least listen in to see, if there was anything helpful I should be thinking about as we kind of move through the transaction.
Perfect. And you wrote an accepted offer on a condo?
Yes.
Nice. Awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. First one. So.
First of many.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. We've got Brianna joining us here. Bridget. Hi, Bridget.
Hi.
Hi there, Bridget. Hi, Brianna.
All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Please stop me at any time if you want me to dive deeper into specific parts of the offer to purchase. But otherwise, I'm just kind of go through and really talk about just the main components of the condo offer. And then I'll also talk about just some of those key differences, obviously, with between a condo and a residential offer to purchase. So to start off the top here, let me jump over, I've got two open. I did pull up a listing in MLS just to kind of use as a reference. So we've got Brian, this is a Falk Rubin Gallagher listing at the Landmark on the Lake, which is a condo downtown. So I went ahead and I started to fill out some of that property information. As a reminder for any offer to purchase, always be sure that you're acknowledging on lines 1 to 2 of the offer who you are an agent of. So if you have a signed buyer agency agreement with your buyer, you are of course an agent of the buyer. So you would strike the other 2 options. Get this out of my way. If you do not have a signed buyer agency agreement with that buyer, you are an agent of the seller by default. And that buyer would be a customer. So just ensure you're properly communicating that in the offer to purchase. Obviously, buyer's name goes on line 3, and then lines 4 through 9, you're indicating the property that the buyer is placing an offer on. So with the condo, obviously you're including the street address, so 1660 North Prospect Ave, the city, the county, but then one key difference here with the condo is you're acknowledging what's the unit number. If there's a building number, some condos have like building A, B, C, or building numbers. In this case, there's just one building. So we can leave this blank, or better yet, put an A in the box. And then what is the name of the condominium? So Landmark on the Lake. All this information can be found in MLS. So in this case, here's the condominium name. The unit number is at the top within the property address information. So that's where you can find all those details. Purchase price is next. Inclusions and exclusions, just like the residential offer to purchase. Typically we look at what is the seller acknowledging in per MLS. So per MLS, the seller has acknowledged the different appliances that are included, or window treatments, washer and dryer. So unless the buyer has any objections to any of those items that the seller is advertising as being included or excluded, we just usually just copy and paste what's indicated in MLS. But again, make sure you're going through that with your buyer. So if they say, you know what, I don't want those window treatments to stay, I want to do my own custom, you would acknowledge that as an exclusion. And vice versa. Same thing with, I see this sometimes a lot with light fixtures. Like if light fixtures are obviously considered a fixture, so they're automatically deemed included, but sometimes sellers, every once in a while, a seller may flop out the type of light fixture. If it's something that's a beautiful chandelier that maybe they want to take with them. Of course, as a listing agent, you want to be sure that that's communicated ahead of time or even switched out before it's listed so that there is no confusion. But if you're the buyer and you really want that specific light fixture, sometimes it's important to be very specific in your inclusions and exclusions. So just a little note about that. Then it goes on to talk about storage, parking, and fees. So obviously this is unique to a condo offer. It talks about whether a storage unit is or is not included, and then if so, what is the storage unit number? So again, all this information would be found in MLS. If it's not, it's a great idea to reach out to the listing agent and get that information ahead of time. So you can see here in private remarks, they've listed what's the parking space number, what's the storage space number, as well as the association fee per month. Some of this other information you can see, it talks about the unit description, talks about common amenities, what does the condo fee include? This is all obviously like an advertisement, right? So it is always best practice to verify that this information is accurate. And you could do that by reviewing, the buyer would do that by reviewing the condo docs, which we'll get to that in a minute.
I've got a quick question. So
Yes.
the one that I'm actually working on now, so the MLS states 2 assigned parking spots and 2 storage units. We've gotten some condo docs, but not all yet. And it says just 1 parking space per unit. So that would be an example of one where we would want to go back to the listing agent to confirm that it is in fact 2.
Yep. And you also would have, with those condo docs, typically you get the contact information for the condo association. And Joan, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's totally appropriate for you as the buyer's agent or even the buyer to reach out to the association and get that verification directly from them.
Okay.
If there's any confusion or.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we're having a bit of a challenge getting everything.
Yeah. So with that, I'll just jump quickly to, because that's actually just a good segue. I'll jump back to this part, but that is the biggest piece of a condo offer is those condo disclosure materials and the buyer's review period. So starting at line 107, it talks about what this all entails. So the seller agrees to deliver to the buyer. They have 10 days, within 10 days of acceptance, current and accurate copies of the condo disclosure materials. And there's a whole list here of all the different materials that a seller is obligated to provide to the buyer within 10 days of acceptance. Sometimes you will see in MLS, if you go under documents, you'll see some of the condo docs. Looks like they've uploaded the condo docs here. I don't know if everything is in here, but so some listing agents will be proactive with that and put everything in MLS. So a buyer's agent has the opportunity to give that to the buyer right away. But if the buyer doesn't get everything, technically the seller has 10 days to give everything to the buyer. Then once the buyer is in receipt of everything, they have 5 business days to review all the documents. And if the buyer, I'll just read here, starting at line 131, the buyer may, within 5 business days after receipt of all the required disclosure documents, or following notice of any material changes in the required disclosure documents, rescind this offer by written notice delivered to the seller. So something like that with the parking spaces and the storage, if it was advertised as 2 that were included, and after reviewing the condo docs, the buyers now learn, okay, there's only 1. The buyer has rescission rights simply by just reviewing those documents. So they have an opportunity to review and verify all that information, and then they can rescind the offer if they wish. The deadlines of this is all really important. Joan and I have been in contact with our attorney just to kind of get clarification on what kind of notice is best to deliver to the seller to acknowledge as the buyer, hey, I've gotten everything. So right now, back up here, we have this notice X or template in zip form that you as a buyer's agent can have your buyer sign that acknowledges receipt of all of the condo docs that are required, which then triggers that 5-day period from which the buyer has the opportunity to review. So this is the most common practice, whether it's this kind of notice. Some firms have an actual like PDF that itemizes all of the required documents. Buyer would initial that, yep, I've received all of these items. This is obviously a very general version of that kind of notice. So this is what we've used historically. We're looking at kind of revamping this to be a little more in depth. But either way, you know, from both sides of the transactions, it's good to have that formal acknowledgement of receipt of those condo docs. So there is no question of, okay, when does that buyer's 5-day period begin?
And there's been a question of, say the listing agent has put those disclosure documents on MLS, like the example that Kimmy showed, that they were already in there. And obviously the buyer has access to those through their agent to see those even before they write the offer. So a question has come up, when do the 5 business days start? Since they have been able to see them even before they write the offer. One suggestion was they start on the date of acceptance of the offer. So even though they had time to review it before they wrote the offer, their 5 business days started upon acceptance. Is that what you agreed to too?
Yep, that's what I have read as well.
Right. So the 5 business days, and remember it's business days. Most other days count in an offer of days, but this is one of the exceptions where Saturdays and Sundays and holidays are not included in those 5 days. And the 5 days start, as it says in the offer, upon receipt of all the required documents. So like you were saying, you're still missing some. Your 5 days haven't started yet.
Yes, I think the notices are nice to use just to get total clarification of when does that time period start. And I think the only time we see like issues with it is when a buyer wants to rescind, obviously. So then that's when with the question of, well, okay, are they still in the rescission period? So again, this slide, like 131 all the way to 143 really goes into depth about the buyer's rescission rights. But I would just say it as a buyer's agent, it's just so important to make sure within, you know, that should be step number 1 after accepted offer. Let's make sure the buyer has copies of all of the condo disclosure materials so that they can review them and provide any objections in a timely manner. Does that help with?
Yes, it does. Sorry. Got you propped up a little on arm's reach.
No worries. And then with that too, there is, so here, you know, we've got our list of the required disclosure materials, A through H. There is a contingency for additional condominium information. So a buyer could choose to, yep, okay, I want to check this box, which means I want the seller to not only provide me this required list, but I also want them to provide me this list of documents. So this is obviously optional, but totally up to the buyer if they want to include this as well. Something I came across last week for the first time, and I think the WRA just released this this year. If you're on the listing side of a condo, see where I can find request for condominium disclosure, and I'll add this to our templates for a listing, condo listing template. But what this form does is it outlines all of those required disclosure documents, and this is for a seller to use with their condo association. So it's a way for the seller to formally request from their condo association all these documents. So here's our list of those required documents. And then here's a list of those potential additional documents that a buyer could potentially ask for. So a seller can use this with their condo association to find out what is all available, and if what's not available, it's important to know, because then as the seller, when you're reviewing an offer and you see this contingency for additional condo information, you can say the seller can say to the agent, hey, I know that the condo association does not have a statement from the association indicating the balance of reserve accounts controlled by the association, or whatever it may be. They don't have that. So a seller could counter the offer and strike any items that they don't have access to. Because if not, and they leave all these items here, and the seller isn't able to provide it to the buyer because they just simply don't have it, the buyer would have rescission rights. So just some additional homework that the seller, for our listing agent to give to the seller when listing a condo.
Now, one of the backstories of the importance of this is any new improvements that the condo association is contemplating, and whether they have come up with something, they've rolled it out on the table, they've actually bid on it, they've actually voted to adopt it. All of those steps in doing something with the condo are important to a new buyer, because it's either something that the current seller is responsible to pay that additional fee for, if it was found out to be decided and voted on while the seller was still there, or it's something that's going to be done in the near future but hasn't been voted on. It would be some responsibility of the new buyer. So one of the suggestions, especially people who write on condos a lot, is to, under that additional condominium information, is to ask for at least the minutes of the last 3 meetings, because that's where you see topics being brought up of something that's proposed to be done, or something that's been voted on, or something like that. So if you're going to add any additional condominium information, if it's available, the minutes, and usually the last 3 owners meetings is sufficient. You can ask for the last year, but that's something where you can see what they talked about or what's a proposed improvement to the condominiums.
Awesome. Thanks, Joan. All right, I'll jump back up a little bit. All right, back to our binding acceptance. So typically 24 hours is what we give the other party to respond. Of course, these are things, we talked about this in Ignite. If you're in Ignite, just kind of some of those checklists of things to do before you're submitting an offer, and one of which is contacting that listing agent to let them know, hey, my buyer is going to be submitting an offer. When is the seller going to be prepared to review offers? So that information will help you determine what date and time to put for binding acceptance. Just a quick little reminder here. At the top of your offers, make sure that you're including the property address. So typically in zip form, it will auto-populate from the property address you include up at the top onto the top of the additional pages, but you can go through and add any missing information. I sometimes see that this gets missed. So make sure you're going back and adding the property address. And then once you include it on one page, it will auto-populate to the rest. The closing date. So the transaction is to be closed on what date? We've kind of edited our forms to say that it's at the place selected by the buyer versus at the place selected by the seller. But of course, that can always be adjusted. Typically, when a buyer is using a lender, it's just easier to coordinate with the lender as far as the location, which is the reason for that change. Earnest money. So same with the residential offer to purchase. Earnest money is typically 1 to 2% of the offer. Obviously, the more earnest of the purchase price, obviously the more earnest money you put the buyer puts down, the stronger the offer looks. Earnest money, I like to kind of refer to it as almost like a security deposit. It's buyer showing the seller good faith of that I'm going to move forward with this purchase using all my best efforts, and I'm not going to just leave $5,000 on the table. As far as the disbursement of earnest money, if the deal does not close, that is all outlined below here. There is never a guarantee that a buyer is going to get their earnest money back, even if they're walking on, they have an inspection contingency and they delivered a notice of defect. There's just never, ever a guarantee. Obviously the buyer is certainly protected by their contingencies, but you never want to guarantee a buyer that they're going to get their earnest money back no matter what. So as long as the buyer is doing their due diligence and using good faith and following through with the contract, if something were to fall apart, they will most likely get their earnest money back, but never a guarantee. Typically, so 5 days is the default for earnest money. Again, shorter period looks a little bit more appealing, 3 or 4 days. It's typically always held by the listing firm. So as far as earnest money goes, you're going to defer to the listing firm, the listing agent, as far as their preference for how it's delivered. I mean, here it says it can be mailed or personally delivered or electronically delivered. So a lot of listing firms now are using trust funds, which is the preferred method, electronically, but kind of up to the buyer and the listing firm as far as what's best. Moving on, so we'll skip through here this kind of disclosure material since we just went through that. Buyer rescission rights. Of course, we've got our list of just definitions of what each, what certain parts are further defined as. So this is always a good section to go through to help refresh your memory on the different components. References a real estate condition report. If a seller provides a real estate condition report, that would be acknowledged here. With a condominium, in addition to a real estate condition report, you're also going to see an addendum to the real estate condition report. See if they've got one up here. The addendum to the condition report, here it is. It always includes the condominium information, and this again is the contact information. So if your buyer has questions about documents or the condo docs in general, the condo association is always a great resource, and their contact information is usually on the addendum to the real estate condition report. The condo addendum to the real estate condition report also includes disclosures of any assessments, fees, and charges, and whether all current charges have been paid. Okay. Similar to our residential offer to purchase, a buyer has the opportunity to do an inspection. Same thing where we've got an inspection. Testing is totally separate. Radon test is totally separate. So an inspection is only authorizing inspections, not testing, of the unit and any limited common elements that may be used only by the owner of the condominium unit. So if a buyer wishes to have other components of the building inspected, potentially, maybe it's a smaller, like 6-unit condominium or something, they would need to specifically address those on line 328 and 329, because otherwise the general inspection is simply of the unit, and again, any of those limited common elements used only by the owner of the unit. So it'd be like a balcony, any space that's specifically associated with that unit. 15 days is our default for a home inspection. to make an offer look stronger, you might include a 10 to 14 day inspection contingency period. Just be aware that all the inspection, any follow-up inspections, and all negotiations related to any repairs that might need to be made must happen within that 10 to 15 day period. So you want to be sure the buyer has enough time to do all of those things. I'm not going to get too far into the notice of defects and right to cure. I do a whole separate 1 hour training on this topic, which is recorded in our YouTube training videos. But very generally speaking, the question of giving the seller the right to cure or not. So when the buyer gives the seller the right to cure, they're basically giving the seller that that the ball is in your court to determine if this deal is going to move forward in the event I have to deliver a notice of defect. So giving the seller the right to cure allows the seller to say, yep, I'm going to fix everything, the deal's moving forward, or no, I'm not going to fix these items and the transaction is null and void. And then vice versa, if seller does not have the right to cure, then it's kind of in the buyer's hands. So the buyer would be potentially with the decision, okay, I've got a number of repairs that need to be made. Seller isn't, we've tried to come to an agreement by executing an amendment. Seller and I are not on the same page. Do I terminate this transaction by delivering a notice of defects, or do I move forward as is? So again, not giving the seller the right to cure kind of puts it in the buyer's hands as to whether the transaction stays together or not.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to,
yeah.
Excuse me. One thing I'd like to add in this, occasionally I hear agents say, oh, I always write in seller has the right to cure, or I always write in seller does not have the right to cure. That's really not a good advice to follow, because it should be very specific to your buyer, to the circumstances of the property, to the seller, the listing agent, on whether or not your buyer should give the seller right to cure or not. So make sure that it's very specific to that one transaction, and don't lump it in and saying, oh, I always give them right to cure or whatever. And especially in strategies for writing competitive offers, you hear agents say, well, in competition, I always give the seller right to cure. That's a good idea because obviously it's a stronger offer for the seller, but it may not be the best advice for your buyer. So again, look at that right to cure as something really important and specific to that one transaction.
Yeah, I've seen.
How do you kind of decide, Joan? Sorry.
Pardon me?
What kind of examples do you have of when I should think, okay, like this would not be a good time to give the seller the right to cure? This seems like a better, like, you know what I mean? How you were saying that depends on situations.
I would say one kind of example would be maybe you had some really tough negotiations with that seller or that listing agent, and you don't get a real good feeling of cooperation. Another situation could be you're really not sure to the extent of which a defect in that property is really a defect. I mean, it could be disclosed that there is some trickle of water and your inspection shows a trickle of water is much more extensive than that, and you don't want to get into it. And it's just something you don't want to ever deal with. And so you want that right to cure to be able to get out of it. So it's like little red flags, in all kinds of things that you want to preserve that buyer having the right to cure, or not giving the seller the right to cure, the buyer having the option to control the cancellation of the offer. But it will look less attractive to a seller, obviously.
Yeah, I think it really, really is so important to explain to the buyer what it means. I mean, I've seen a number of tough situations where I don't think it was explained very well to the buyer ahead of time what it meant to give the seller the right to cure. And then the buyer thinks, okay, there's all these defects and the seller isn't willing to fix them the way I want them to fix them, so I want out. Well, that's not the way it works. So it's so important to make sure the buyer understands what it means to give the seller the right to cure,
Exactly.
because there may not be a way out. Even if there's significant issues, if a seller is willing to cure them in a good and workmanlike manner, the transaction moves forward. So,
And you can strengthen that right to cure if you want to by writing in the offer that any right to cure, seller agrees to cure with a licensed contractor providing liens and permits and things like that, because you can't ask for that in a notice of defect. But if you ask for it up front, if the seller elects to cure, you want it done a certain way, it has to be in your offer.
yep. So I scrolled all the way down to the last page. Unfortunately, this is the only, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's a big, big section. You're going to go to additional provisions, and this is where you can add an additional provision like Joan was just mentioning. We do have a template in our clause library of this language. When you click in the additional provisions box, click on this pencil icon and click on the scroll, this opens up the clause library. And you'll see there's a few different categories, but in the offer to purchase category, you can look for the right to cure. And then you can insert this provision and you can tweak it a little bit too if you need to. So this says the seller shall have the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner using professional licensed experts with the benefit of permit as required in accordance with municipal building code. The scope of the work shall be defined by an independent third-party expert. So that means a third-party expert's coming in, like a structural engineer, they're saying, this is what I'm recommending needs to be done. Then the seller would be obligated to cure the defect based on that report. Whereas if you don't include language like this, the verbiage in the offer is simply the seller shall cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And that doesn't always sit well with buyers, especially when you're talking about major foundation work, things like that. So definitely something to consider adding. Here we've got our radon testing contingency, which is separate from inspection. The testing contingency is in addendum A. So be sure to include that if your buyer wishes to have any testing done. Radon test is probably not something you would do in most condos unless it's a condo that lives like a single family home. I'm trying to think what other testing you might need to do in a condo. I mean, if it's an older condo, you could always maybe asbestos or mold. Might be something the buyer wants to have the option to test for. But you typically don't see radon testing for condos, but it obviously is always the buyer's choice. Financing contingency, just like it is in read, just like it is in our residential offer to purchase. So if the buyer needs financing and needs a contingency to get financing, it would be acknowledged here. Again, I'm not going to go too much into this because we do a separate training just on the financing contingency. Are there any specific questions on financing contingency that you want me to go through? All right, we'll just kind of breeze through that then. Again, if the buyer is not getting, if they don't have a financing contingency, they must provide a pre-approval letter, proof of buyer's funds within 7 days of an accepted offer.
I guess I have one question.
Yes.
Dumb question again, but
Dumb questions.
if you have a financing contingency, and obviously there's going to be an appraisal, whether you have an appraisal contingency or not, and if it appraises and their financing won't come through, I guess, can't you get out of the deal if your financing contingency doesn't come through? It makes me wonder why we'd have the appraisal contingency.
Well, because some buyers, a lender may still be able to provide loan commitment to a buyer, I think. even if the property doesn't appraise, just means the buyer has to bring the difference to closing. So if a buyer is in a position where they have, the lender has proof that the buyer has sufficient cash to close, they might still, again, they're looking at like debt to income ratio, they're looking at all those numbers. They may say, yeah, we could still provide you a loan, even if it didn't appraise.
Gotcha.
That's the case.
Okay,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
An example, we're actually going through this with my parents. So, excuse me, like purchase price, the 355, but because they're putting $200,000 down, the bank said, if you want to do an appraisal, you can, but we don't need one because they're only mortgaging, 155 of it.
Yeah, generally, you use an appraisal contingency when you're financing is in a situation like Liz was talking about, when they have like 20% down or they have more than 20% down. There's a big gap in what the lender is able to finance it and then what the property is actually worth. So if the buyers are concerned that they're not buying something that's, they're paying too much for because they're putting so much down, then they might want an appraisal contingency to establish the value being at the purchase price. And if you've got a lot going down, sometimes the lender will only appraise it for the loan amount. And there's a big gap sometimes between the loan amount and the purchase price. But again, adding an appraisal contingency weakens a competitive offer.
Yeah. I did have a question over the weekend or last week, kind of similar. Buyer was getting financing and the lender did not have to do an appraisal, but they had an appraisal contingency. And the question was, can the buyer choose to just hire their own appraiser to do an appraisal if they want? And yeah, they can if they have an appraisal contingency. The buyer could certainly hire their own appraiser to come in and do an appraisal. But in most cases, with the buyer getting financing, the lender is ordering the appraisal for the buyer. That's typical. Seller financing, I would say now that this has been separated off from the financing contingency, it's typically, I don't see it used ever. But the buyer could certainly include this, which says, if I can't get my loan, my financing, seller, I would allow you to finance the transaction so that this deal stays together in the event I can't get financing. I haven't seen anybody use it, but it's there.
I used it a long time ago.
What's that?
I used it a long time ago.
Really? I've seen people like attempt to look into using it back when it was a part of the financing contingency. And then I think when sellers really looked into what it all entailed, they were like, yeah, never mind, I'm just going to let this buyer go because.
This was a situation where the buyers were trying to get out based on a sort of forged rejection letter from a lender.
Oh, wow.
And so my seller, I was the listing agent, my seller said, well, I'll finance it. And was able to do so that matched the terms in the buyer's financing contingency and did that. So the buyers had to go through with the closing because the seller fulfilled the financing contingency.
Wow.
Yeah, there were a lot of fireworks over that.
Oh, I'm sure. All right. So again, if this offer is not contingent on financing, here again is where I mentioned that within 7 days is the default. The buyer must deliver reasonable written verification that they have sufficient funds to close, or any other document the buyer is going to deliver to the seller. Here's where we have our appraisal contingency. So this is separate from the financing commitment contingency. As far as deadlines go, sometimes I see the appraisal contingency and financing contingency, the same 35 days. If you're going to make one shorter, definitely make the appraisal contingency shorter, maybe 30 days for the appraisal, as that's always done first before loan commitment's delivered. there is now a right to cure section with the appraisal contingency. So giving the seller the right to cure would basically give the seller the opportunity to amend the purchase price in the event the property doesn't appraise. Versus if you don't give the seller the right to cure, the buyer can just unilaterally terminate the offer if the property doesn't appraise. I would say in most cases with the appraisal, like a notice is never even delivered. It's really easy, just, okay, buyer, the property didn't appraise, let's execute an amendment to reduce the price to, sorry, I see somebody in the waiting room, to the appraised value. So, yeah, I would say in most cases again, it's up to the buyer, but with regards to the appraisal contingency, giving the seller the right to cure is more common than not. Closing a buyer's property contingency and the bump clause. So if the buyer has a property to sell that they must sell in order to purchase, they can include that as a contingency here. So in most cases, the closing date for this, or the deadline for this contingency, is going to be the same as the closing date. That's, again, typically if the buyer needs to sell the property on or before they purchase, the date that they purchase this new condo. And then with that, they can have the option to include a bump clause. So meaning the seller can continue to market the property and accept secondary offers. If the seller does accept a secondary offer, they can give notice to this primary buyer who has the property contingency and try to bump them out. Then when the primary buyer receives notice, hey, seller's got a secondary offer, buyer has to either waive this contingency in order to stay in primary position, or if they can't, then their offer is null and void and they're no longer purchasing the property. There's a few different requirements that a seller can have the buyer provide with a bump clause. So what's default is the waiver of their closing a buyer's property. So if nothing else is added, that's all the buyer has to do, is they just have to say, okay, yep, we're waiving this contingency. We're good to purchase this condo even in the event our current home does not sell. A seller can request or could counter the offer and say, okay, not only do you need to provide that, but you also must waive your inspection contingency or your financing contingency or your appraisal contingency. And you must also provide any of these options: proof of bridge loan or proof of funds. So there's a few different ways that bump clause can work. Secondary offer, this would only be acknowledged if there is already a primary offer accepted, which is typically advertised in MLS. I have not seen I'm sure people do fail to acknowledge that in MLS, but all right, closing proration. So the following items are prorated at closing. So just like a residential offer to purchase, but with the addition of condominium association fees and additional association fees. So everything is prorated at closing. And then the buyer can determine how the taxes are prorated. So typically the first box is what's checked, which is just taking the taxes from the previous year or the current year if available. But then there are some different options. And I would say the other options are used more so if you feel like the taxes are going to be significantly different from the previous year. So maybe it's brand new construction, or maybe the condo was significantly renovated, where you know that the tax from the previous year is not an accurate, it's not going to be similar to what the current year's is going to be. All right, I'm going to skip down here to lines 543 and 544. So lines 543 talks about unpaid condo assessments. It says all unpaid assessments shall be paid by the seller no later than closing. But special assessments is next. Special assessments, if any, including those by any condo or additional association, levied or for work actually commenced prior to the date of this offer, shall be paid by the seller no later than closing. So anything levied or work that actually started prior to the time this offer was written. Again, remember it says the offer was written, not of acceptance. It's paid by the seller. All other special assessments shall be paid by the buyer. So anything that, if any special assessments get levied after acceptance, but before closing, it's the responsibility of the buyer. So I've seen some agents alter this a little bit to say that, to change to say shall be paid, basically to say any special assessment levied or work actually commenced prior to the date of closing shall be paid by the seller. I've seen that altered. There's obviously nothing wrong with leaving it as is. Okay. That's really the gist of the condo offer to purchase. Any questions before we wrap up here?
Did a great job, Kimmy.
Thank you, Joan.
Yes, thank you. So we have our inspection on the condo on Wednesday. Storage units that are located in the garage, do they typically open those for the inspection? Or is it a case by case?
A few years ago, I did a condo and it was a smaller building. They did go down into the basement, into the storage unit.
Mhm.
I mean, technically speaking, it's a limited common element, right? It's associated with the
unit.
With the unit. So it would be fair game.
Okay.
A lot of them are open cages too, where.
Yeah, this one is not, but you know, of course we ran into a neighbor and he showed us his, but we couldn't see inside the ones actually assigned to the unit.
Yeah, you can ask for it in your offer.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, other than if you've got any suggestions or things to keep in mind, specifically one, because I have the inspection on Wednesday, or as we kind of move through, or any recommendations on how to get the rest of these condo docs, because everybody's kind of between the listing agent and HomeWise and the association president. And I think there's even a fourth person that they're all saying, no, that's the person who gives you that. So.
That's tricky. I mean, I guess I would put the pressure on the listing agent.
Okay.
Because if the buyer doesn't get them all, they will.
What was that, Joan?
Sorry, say that again.
If you don't get the documents, I mean, the buyer can stay in the offer, but they can also rescind all the way up to the last minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the risk so again, that's why I would put it on the listing agent. They're putting their seller at risk for not getting those documents to the buyer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you said this is a smaller condominium?
2 buildings, 18 units each.
Okay. Yeah, I have found that, I mean, it all depends on the condo, the building and the association. those associations that are like run by, so like Landmark on the Lake, huge condo building, right?
Mhm.
They have a professional like property management company that runs their association.
Yeah.
They're, by experience, they were always pretty easy to get in touch with and get all the documents. But a smaller association where you've got, somebody living in the building who's the association president,
hmm
sometimes a little bit more challenging to get
Okay.
things from
Okay.
my periods. But yeah, I would just keep pushing the listing agent to help
Yeah.
assist you with getting those documents.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then for your inspection, I mean, you're gonna, typically you'll get the report within, you'll get a sense after going through the inspection, kind of what your buyer might be objecting to.
hmm
But you'll get the report typically, in the next 24 hours. Sometimes it's nice to kind of give the listing agent a little update. You can let them know when you've wrapped up, give them a quick little update of how the inspection went.
Yeah.
I wouldn't speak, specifically to what your buyer's objections are, because you kind of
Yeah.
want to wait to have that conversation with them. But and then you get the report, you can review it with the buyers. And then typically the first step, if there are items that the buyers want fixed, they can ask the seller to make specific repairs. They might need to get follow-up inspections
Yeah.
if indicated by the inspector. Sometimes the inspector will note, hey, you might need to get an electrician here to look at this, or HVAC technician. And then, yeah, the buyer can decide, okay, I want the seller to fix these things, or you know what, a credit would be nice for me to go ahead and fix these things later. Just be careful with the credit. The closing credit can only be applied towards closing costs. There is a cap.
Yes.
How
Right.
much a buyer can get. Sometimes the purchase price is amended as well. So there's a few different ways to negotiate with the seller. But then you would put it in writing on a WB-40 amendment to the offer. And you just simply, there's a great template in zip form here. So let me just go in, add an amendment here. So again, if I go into that clause library, it's acting slow. There we go. Under inspection amendment, it kind of gives just a nice little like starting point for your amendment.
Okay.
Which says the following shall be completed at the expense of the seller with all applicable lien waivers, invoices, and permits provided to the buyer no later than 10 days prior to closing. Upon acceptance, the inspection contingency is waived. And then just making like an itemized list of seller to hire an electrician to do the following repairs,
Okay.
plumber, whatever.
Yeah.
It's important to be very specific. So if there is electrical work, to say hire a licensed electrician, to
Yes.
licensed plumber. So
Okay.
that's kind of a nice.
So one of the things that's questioned a lot is, do I refer to the inspection report in the amendment? It's a good idea not to, because the lender is required to get this amendment, and the lender is obligated then, if there's a referral to an inspection report, the lender, the underwriters will say, what inspection report? And it would have to be then sent to the lender also.
Okay.
Most lenders will say, please, we don't want to see that at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
So you make it specific to the actual location in the house, to what the actual defect they want cured, but don't refer it at this point to the inspection. When you write the notice of defect, where you're actually saying this is it, then you refer it to the inspection and the page and whatever.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, good luck with that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything else we can help you with, ladies? Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us today. Have a great rest of your
Give me
Monday.
a random question
Yeah.
that not everyone, like, it won't help it. But that listing of mine is, my first closing is February 22nd, and I submitted everything to you through command, and I just want to make sure I didn't mess anything up. When do I typically hear from you that everything's been like approved or?
Yep, so you'll get a notification. If everything's approved, you'll get a notification that it was approved. If something was returned, again, you'll get a notification that it was returned along with a, so if you go into an opportunity, let's see if I can. Well, here, can we go into yours right now?
Yeah, go for it. Let's see what's happening.
What's the opportunity name?
609 North 78, I think is what it's under. I'll double check.
I gotta jump off, but thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Liz.
Have a great day.
Here, Maroney.
Yep.
Okay.
I guess I should
Yep,
name
so
them.
you're approved.
Like, what do
So you'll
people
see
normally?
here, everything's approved.
Oh,
You're good.
I should just go back in to see that. Got it.
And then just be sure that you are uploading, like if there was an amendment that was executed after the inspection, you're going to go into the under contract folder, click add item, and then you'll call it amendment related to the inspection or whatever you want to call it. And then you'll upload it through there and then resubmit it.
Thank you. Exciting. Thanks.
Yeah,
Just want to make
It is
sure.
good. Oh.
very exciting. Awesome.
Thank you guys so much.
You're welcome.
See ya.
Thank you.